Yep, it is. I myself prefer the old-fashioned hot cocoa. So welcome everyone to our third Discovery Speaker Series. My name is Clarissa. I'm the Program Volunteer Coordinator for the Puget Sound Estuarium. And we host this talk every first Thursday of the month. We have this talk so that we can invite scientists, artists, earth advocates, and educators to talk about their current work or what their organization does so that we can spark conversations in our community. So because we want to spark those conversations, you are welcome to ask questions. If you are on Zoom, you can type them into the Q&A. For those joining us on Facebook Live, you can comment below the video your questions, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. We'll leave some time so that we can get to all your questions. For those with families, or for those artistically minded or maybe not artistically minded at all, we do have a coloring page to go along with the talk that you can print out. For the first one, I chose color pencils. For the second one, I used some watercolors. I'm going crayons today. Feel free to share those with us after the talk so we can see all your beautiful drawings or colorings that you've done. And then if you find this talk very interesting and want to share it with people that you know, or you can't make the rest of this talk, you can only stay for a short time, know that it will be on Facebook after it has finished. And you can also find it on our YouTube channel. We'll post it there in the future. So I am pleased to welcome Shaara Ainsley. Did I say it right?
Shaara, yeah.
Shaara Ainsley, who is the Senior Project Manager at Long Live the Kings. They are a nonprofit or an organization started in 1986 to restore salmon and steelhead populations and support sustainable fishing. Today, we'll get to learn about the scientific research that they've been conducting with partners and hear about how they can use that scientific research that they've conducted to improve the fish passage at the Hood Canal Bridge. It is one of the deadliest fish passages in Washington, and so it was really important research for them to conduct, and we're going to hear about some of the mitigation policies that we can put into effect to potentially help increase our steelhead populations. So without further ado, Shaara, you can take it away.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I will share my screen so you can all see the presentation, hopefully. And hopefully I don't lose all your faces either. Can you see my thumbs up? Great. Well, thank you so much to the Puget Sound Estuarium for inviting us today to present on surviving Hood Canal. And this is going to be a presentation on the science and solutions to support steelhead survival at the Hood Canal Bridge. And I, as you mentioned, work for Long Live the Kings as a project manager. So I'll also be introducing, it's not moving forward. Let's see. There we go. Introducing Long Live the Kings to you all. I'll talk about the science used to investigate the mysterious deaths of steelhead at the Hood Canal Bridge. We'll talk about the resulting discoveries and then solutions that we'll be testing to try to resolve this significant challenge. And Long Live the Kings we have a mission to restore wild salmon and steelhead and support sustainable fishing in the Pacific Northwest. And we do this through advancing science, improving management, and implementing solutions. And Hood Canal Bridge project really touches on all of these different aspects of our approach. And our goal is to learn, plan, and act on behalf of the salmon. And salmon are an important part of the marine food web of the Salish Seas. Commercial salmon fishing and recreational angling are economically important, as well as culturally important to the Pacific Northwest. And salmon have been vital and essential to Native people since time immemorial. So salmon are just deeply rooted in our culture in Pacific Northwest. And I thought, since I was a lover of mysteries when I was a kid, I was a big fan of Agatha Christie and Nancy Drews, I thought it might be fun today to change it up a little bit and present today's presentation as a mystery story. And so the elements of a good mystery story are having an interesting setting, having charismatic characters, a crime victim and sleuth or sleuths, mysterious crime, a trail of clues, the big reveal, and then hopefully a solution to this novel. So we'll be presenting this I'll be presenting this as a bit of a mystery story. And so the setting for tonight is the Hood Canal. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Hood Canal, the canal runs along Puget Sound and is kind of J-shaped or a reverse J. It's a long, deep canal. And there's a long, deep history of people living in the Hood Canal area, which I want to acknowledge with the caveat that this is not my personal history. But the lands have been inhabited by several tribes, including the S'Klallam, the Suquamish, and what is now called the Skokomish tribe, which was primarily composed of Tawana peoples. And despite its name, it's not actually a canal. It's a 60-mile-long fjord. A canal is actually a term for an artificial waterway. So it's a bit of a misnomer, but it's also very deep. And so if you can imagine starting at Lynch Cove, which is at the very end of the canal, and moving towards the Hood Canal entrance to the Puget Sound, this is the bathymetry or the depth profile. So you would start relatively shallow, and then it gets very deep towards the middle of the canal, so deep that it's almost the same height or the same depth as the Space Needle is high. So the Space Needle is 605 feet high, and the depth is about 600 feet. And then it gets shallower again as you move towards the mouth. And then as you pass the Hood Canal Bridge, it's about 100 meters deep, which is about 300 feet deep. So it's quite deep. And so that is an important piece of our story today, is that the Hood Canal Bridge area is quite deep. And that deep channel posed an engineering challenge for the bridge when they were building it. So this is something that maybe we don't appreciate when we drive across the bridge, or at least I haven't for most of my life, appreciated that this is a really deep part of the canal, and that this bridge is actually floating across it, because they were not able to build the kind of bridge where you would build beams or posts and then elevate the bridge on that. And so they found a pinch point in the canal, or a narrower spot, and they decided to build the longest floating marine bridge in the world. And how it floats is actually on concrete blocks, which sounds really crazy. And when I first found that out, I was a little bit nervous about driving across it. But the concrete blocks are hollow inside. And so all that air trapped inside of these concrete pontoons, they're called pontoons, that air allows it to float. And so you have numerous concrete pontoons, and then across that, or on top of that, is this elevated roadway. And then the pontoons are floating in the top part of the water, and they extend about 15 feet underwater. And that's also an important clue for our mystery. So the pontoons are across the water in about 15 feet, and they are side by side. So there's no space in between those pontoons. There's some space where there are no pontoons, and that is on the very ends near where the bridge connects to land. And then in the very center, it's actually a drawbridge. And so the very center doesn't have pontoons, and the roadway can retract and allow vessels to pass through. So the pontoons are spanning 83% of the width of Hood Canal and extend 15 feet underwater. So that's the setting. The characters for our mystery include the Puget Sound Steelhead as the victim of the crime, and the Hood Canal Bridge assessment team as the set of sleuths that will answer this question. So Long Live the Kings, the organization I work for, they are the facilitators of the assessment team. So I'm a project manager. We work to help facilitate meetings and help keep the project moving forward, making sure everybody's got everything they need to accomplish the project. The other folks include the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Navy, the Washington State Department of Transportation, which they're responsible for the bridge, the Port Gamble Slalom Tribe, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Hood Canal Coordinating Council, and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So that's our team of sleuths. And, the first thing that you do in a mystery, when you're trying to solve a mystery, is try to understand the victim first and understand what was the situation, the context that they were in. And steelhead in the Puget Sound are ESA listed, which means that they have been listed under the ESA as threatened. And that and here under State of the Salmon Watersheds, statewide list or way of tracking, they're actually listed as in crisis. And so this means that they are really at low numbers compared to what they were 100 years ago. Annual steelhead returns to Puget Sound ranged from 325,000 to 800,000. And today that number has dwindled to roughly 13,000. So all the way from 800,000 down to 13,000. And fewer than 1,500 of these steelhead return to Hood Canal. So these are a fish that are already in crisis. And here we're looking specifically at the marine survival. So Puget Sound steelhead populations began declining in the late 1980s, and then this followed the threatened listing under the Endangered Species Act in 2007. But here you can see that their ocean survival, their marine survival, and this is actually just being measured from when they leave their rivers where they're born out to when they hit the Pacific Ocean. So just within Puget Sound, basically. And their survival within Puget Sound used to be about 10%. Many of you have watched nature shows on TV. You know that the odds of surviving aren't great for wild animals. And so 10% was, the average survival of making it out to the ocean before, and now it's less than 2%. So it's really declined in the last few decades, and then plateaued starting after about the 90s. So the mysterious crime that we're investigating began when folks at NOAA, including Megan Moore, began investigating the overall low survival of steelhead that I just showed you. So they weren't making it out to the ocean in very large numbers, and why. And so between 2006 and 2010, they were tracking young steelhead as they migrated out of the Hood Canal. And the researchers found that many steelhead went missing and were presumed dead at the Hood Canal Bridge. And so they were finding all these fish were dying near the bridge, or at least were presumed dead. But they didn't have a good, detailed enough data set to understand why. And so that led to this question. And in 2015, local, state, and federal and tribal governments and nonprofits convened to develop a plan to better understand the causes of high steelhead mortality at the bridge. And so this was a big multi-entity effort, and it resulted in 2 years of intensive data collection, analysis, and modeling, which was guided by the assessment team that I introduced earlier. And they helped to identify the impacts of the bridge on juvenile steelhead and recommend near-term and long-term management actions. And so that process is the mystery that I'll be describing today. It's also outlined in detail in the assessment plan and then the report from phase 1, if you want to find those on our website and get into the nitty-gritty of the science. So now you kind of understand the mystery and the victim, and now we're going to sit down and look at the likely suspects list. So the assessment team got together in the beginning, and they thought about what could be causing steelhead mortality and what could be contributing to it at the bridge. So a couple ideas were noise and artificial light from traffic and from the actual bridge lighting. And that could be, those are unnatural aspects of the bridge that could be causing some disturbance to steelhead as they're moving out to the ocean. There's also changes to currents and temperature and salinity that are likely occurring because of the bridge. And the bridge itself may just obstruct the juveniles as they're moving out. It may cause them to turn around or change their behavior. And then predators, birds, and seals have been congregating at the bridge. And so these were all kind of the likely suspects. So we're going to investigate each of these, and we're going to look for clues. So that's my little magnifying glass to remind me to look for clues. So the approaches that we used to look at these different issues for artificial light, we looked at monitoring the artificial light at night, which is also called ALON, artificial light at night. We looked at noise from traffic using monitoring of ambient traffic noise and comparing that to what we'd expect to be disturbing salmon and steelhead. In terms of changes to currents, temperature, and salinity, we use devices to collect data on the water, but also we looked at a model, a 3D model of the currents and temperature in the water and compared that. And then for bridge obstruction, they tracked steelhead as they approached the bridge and evaluated their behavior and their survival. And then for predators, they identified predators and mapped their densities. So I'm going to go through these now in a bit more detail and tell you what they found when they started investigating this trail of clues. So the first clues are sound and light. So Port Gamble Squalum tribe measured the light along the bridge with what we call a LICOR sensor. LICOR is the brand. It's a LICOR sensor and it detects light. And so at night, they went around the bridge and they did these lighting surveys to see what kind of light is actually hitting the surface of the water at night. And they concluded that more work needed to be done to understand these impacts because they were detecting light that was within the range that may affect juvenile chum and Chinook salmon. And the reason they believe that is because there's a lot of research that's happened in other parts of, mostly in freshwater rivers, other parts of Washington state where they've seen salmon behave differently in areas that are lighted, often around bridges at night or around shoreline and docks. And they see different behavior in salmon, and sometimes they see more predation in those areas. And so they detected a similar light level to those studies that found issues. And so they concluded that this could be a potential clue. And then colleagues at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which I will call PNNL, which is not really that much shorter, I've realized. PNNL, they used sound and vibration monitoring systems that they attached to the bridge. And these included hydrophones, which are basically things that can listen to sound underwater and detect sound underwater, and accelerometers, which can detect vibration and motion. And they attached these to the bridge, and they observed that the sounds were mostly below the threshold that they thought would bother salmon or steelhead based on previous research. So that one seemed to be less of an important clue. So PNL also looked at the water quality, and the researchers there examined a three-dimensional hydrodynamic model. And hydrodynamic models are hydro is water and dynamic is motion. And so these are models, computer models that are modeling the motion of water and also temperature and things like that. And so they had this 3D hydrodynamic model, and they looked at how the bridge obstructs the outflow of fresh water. And so a lot of people may not realize, although we've all probably experienced it, that water can be different densities depending on its temperature and how much salinity it has, how much salts it has. And so when you have warm fresh water coming out of a river or coming out of the Hood Canal, it'll be on the surface. And then the deeper water will be this colder water coming in from the ocean, from the rest of the Salish Sea. And that's going to be deeper and saltier. And so you've probably experienced this going swimming in like ponds or rivers or lakes where sometimes there's a stratification is the technical term, where you have warmer water on the top, colder water on the bottom. But because this is a bridge that sits right on the top, it actually obstructs that warmer water and it pushes it down and it causes this mixing to occur. And that wouldn't naturally occur without the bridge. And so that does, they found, have effects on current, salinity, and temperature within 3 miles. It's basically detectable within 3 miles of the bridge. And then as you get further from the bridge, it reduces that distance, the increasing distance, you have less of an ability to detect the change. But it does probably, they concluded, affect salmon who are approaching the bridge in that warmer, shallower water, and then that water is getting pushed down and mixed. So the next clue was steelhead behavior and survival. And so to understand steelhead behavior and survival, researchers have implanted juvenile steelhead with acoustic transmitters. And so they're acoustic, they're sending out an auditory signal, although it's not something that we can hear, and they're transmitting it. And there are these little things that they almost look like little pills, and they're smaller than ½ an inch long. And you can put these into steelhead. Here is, let's see, is it showing up? There we go. You can see here Megan is surgically implanting it in the steelhead's belly. And the steelhead has been anesthetized like you would be for a surgery. She implants the tag in the belly, stitches them up just like you would be for a surgery. And then here is the fish. Oops. Here's the fish, there's a tag in me. And they are allowed to recover before they're released. And then as they are released, they continue on their out migration. And these tags are sending out a signal, and each signal is unique to the fish. So each fish has a unique signal, so the tag can be picked up throughout the Puget Sound. And on the left here is an example of a receiver that can receive that sound. And so how it works is a boat goes around and deploys these receivers throughout Puget Sound. And then they're sitting out there and they're listening for fish. And then when a fish comes by, it releases this, or the tag transmits this signal, and it's detected. And it can tell, because it's a unique signal, it can tell it's fish 1435, whatever, special code. And so it knows that fish. The fish keeps swimming. And then as each fish passes, hundreds of fish, these tags are transmitted, the information from the tags are transmitted to this receiver, and the receiver is logging it. And it can sit out there for months, a year, and log all of this information. And some of the tags are special tags that can also report either temperature or depth of the fish. And so that's a special added feature of some of the tags. So then when the season is over, the scientists go and they pick up the receiver and they go and download it, and then they have to analyze a bunch of data, which takes a lot of time. But once they've analyzed that, then we get some really cool information about the path that each fish takes. And if any of you guys have played our game Long Live the Kings produces every spring, called Survive the Sound, which my title of my talk was supposed to be a play on that. It's an online game where everyone is invited to sponsor their favorite fish and compete with their friends during the 5-day migration. So it takes about 5 days for steelhead to leave their stream and migrate out the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So it's kind of like fantasy football for fish. And if you've never played, you really should. It's really fun. You pick a fish. And if you've ever picked a fish that started in Hood Canal, you may have perished at the bridge. And these fish are based on Megan's data. And so I'll just show you a track of Megan's data using the Survive the Sound, because it's a lot more exciting to watch it. But this is a track of real data. And you can see how this fish moves out the Skokomish River and heads up the canal. And then it gets to the bridge and it kind of swims back and forth and turns around and goes back and forth around the bridge. And then eventually it dies. And this is not unusual for fish that pass the bridge. And so what they found in 2017 and 2018 is that 51 and 44% of the fish respectively that arrived at the bridge did not make it past the bridge. And so this is a huge barrier to fish, to steelhead, young steelhead. That's a really dramatic number. And when we did the math to compare it to Snake River steelhead that have to migrate out down the Snake River and the Columbia River through all those dams, they see a similar level of mortality migrating out the whole way past all those dams that we see just at this one bridge. And so this is a really high level of mortality. And the results really offer a clue that we're seeing these fish moving kind of back and forth along the bridge, trying to look for a way past the bridge. So this is the clue in terms of behavior and survival. And what was really cool is I said before that some of these transmitters include temperature and depth data. So this is where we really learn a lot about what could be causing this. Are fish getting eaten by something? And so the transmitters that included temperature, those I unfortunately don't have the graph available, but 69% of the fish that died that had temperature tags in them had an elevated temperature when they died, that tag. And so fish are ectothermic, so they should be, you know, their body temperature should be about the same temperature as the water around it. So that tag should be pretty cool migrating out. But what you see in the graphs for some of these, for, you know, almost 70% of these fish, is that once they get to the bridge, you see this spike in temperature. And it holds for a couple days and then it goes to very cold. And what that tells us is that the fish was probably consumed by a mammal like us with a high internal body temperature and stayed in the mammal's gut for a little while and then was out the other end and, you know, fell to the bottom of Hood Canal. And so that was an interesting, very important result, is that a lot of the fish that are dying are getting eaten by marine mammals or a bird. Birds can also have that elevated temperature. So then we kind of narrowed it down to marine mammals or birds. And so the other information that we see here is the depth information. I found this really fascinating. So this top graph is a surviving fish. And you can see that that fish, despite the fact that it's 100 meters deep at the Hood Canal Bridge and, you know, 600, I'm going back and forth between meters and feet, but it's very deep in the Hood Canal. That fish is migrating out in like the very surface. It is not going very far down at all. This is 10 meters. It's just staying up in that very surface, like 3 to 5 feet surface as they're migrating out. And these fish are small. They're like 6 inches small. So it's really interesting that they migrate out right on the surface there. That's different from other salmonids probably. And then you see some little deep dives, maybe around the bridge, and then it goes on its way. And then the bottom graph is a fish that didn't make it. And here you can see it's moving out at that same surface. And then at some point it starts doing these really deep dives. And these are deep because 30 meters is like 90 feet. And so these fish are all of a sudden doing these really deep, unnatural dives. We don't see that with any of the surviving fish. And so that was an indication that they are probably getting eaten by something that does a lot of diving. And marine mammals and some diving birds can dive like that. But the depth and the magnitude and the frequency of these dives really ruled out most of the bird species observed at the bridge. So it really seems like this is a marine mammal behavior, given the temperature and the diving. And then the last clue was that we found stationary transmitters near a known harbor seal haul-out spot. And stationary transmitters, often that just means that the transmitter hasn't moved, the tag hasn't moved in a long time. And so that usually means that it's no longer in the fish. And often that happens when something eats the fish, then the transmitter goes through their gut and then they poop it out. And so the fact that we found these stationary transmitters near harbor seal haul-outs was also implicating harbor seals as a likely predator. So that is a really big clue. We wanted to follow up on this clue as well, and the Port Gamble Sklallam tribe used an underwater sonar camera called a Blue View to look and watch fish and seals interacting near the bridge. And so this blue view, you can see in the left-hand picture, it's underwater in this triangular thing. And here you can see the unit is kind of like a camera, but it's an acoustic camera. And so that means that the image that it creates looks a lot like an ultrasound. And so this is hopefully a video that you will see of what the scientists see at Port Gamble Sklallam Tribe when they are reviewing the blue view footage. And so here you can see, again, it's like an ultrasound. You can see all these little fish moving around. And then all of a sudden you see this big marine mammal coming in, and it's kind of corralling, circling around the fish. And so what they noticed was the behavior of the fish and the harbor seals near the bridge. The harbor seals were actually using the bridge to kind of corral the fish and catch them more easily. And this is some GoPro footage that they took next to the bridge. And here you can see along the surface, here's some salmonid, juvenile salmonids moving out, steelhead or salmon moving out near the surface. They're swimming along, they're probably feeding. It looks like there's a lot of great food here. And then all of a sudden you see them dart away when this harbor seal comes. And so there was a lot of evidence just from watching the behavior and the interactions around the bridge as well that harbor seals were a likely culprit. And so we wanted to learn a bit more about seals, and one aspect is this increasing seal abundance. So thanks to very successful legal protections for marine mammals that were enacted in the 1970s, harbor seals have really rebounded in the Salish Sea. And in the Strait of Georgia, their seal populations have increased almost exponentially between 70s and 1990s, and then kind of leveled off. And that leveling off suggests that they're at or near a carrying capacity, that the environment can't really handle many more harbor seals. So they've hit that carrying capacity, it looks like, again, around the 90s. And if you remember that marine survival graph for steelhead, and we have similar graphs for Chinook and coho, is there has been this like long decline in marine survival that kind of leveled off near the 90s. So it started in the 70s, 80s, and leveled off near the 90s. And this mimics or corresponds to this substantial increase in harbor seals. So again, this is correlation, not causation. So this is just showing that these patterns are similar, and that as survival has declined, populations of harbor seals have increased. There seems to be a relationship there, but more needs to be investigated. And so, and just making a note that marine survival has remained low since the 90s, despite a lot of harvest reductions. And so there have been a lot of management actions taken to try to help with marine survival, including harvest reductions, trying to cut back on harvesting fish. But again, this is something that hasn't changed much. So unfortunately, I can't see your poll results, but I thought it would be fun for you all to take a poll. So now that we've shown you all of the evidence that the assessment team gathered, or the sleuths gathered, we want you to think about what you think might be the culprit. So is it the bridge because it affects the water quality and it provides artificial lighting that could confuse juvenile steelhead? Or is it the bridge because it creates a barrier for fish? So it's hard for the fish to swim past it. They have to find a way around. Or is it the harbor seals because they are munching on steelhead as they arrive at the bridge? Or is it all of the above? So I'll give you a second to think about it. And this was what we call in the science community synthesis. So at the end of all of the researchers conducting all of their separate studies, they got together and the assessment team gathered back together and they synthesized that information, they processed it, and they looked at the whole group of studies as a whole and tried to gather the information. And their conclusion was that it was all of the above. And this is, the reality of real life and ecology is there's rarely one culprit that you can lock in jail, right? And so the story that the assessment team thinks is happening is that the bridge is acting as a barrier to young steelhead. And the young steelhead, as we said, they're moving out right in the surface, right? And so when they encounter something that, even though it only goes down 15 feet, they're right at the surface, they're unlikely to dive down, or maybe it's difficult for them to dive down. And so to them, most of the bridge is acting almost like a dam. And then it's disorienting them, right? As they're migrating out, they're not expecting this unnatural concrete wall to come out of nowhere. It confuses the fish and they wander around trying to look for a way around. And then the abundant harbor seals in the area are able to catch the confused fish more easily, and especially using those corners and areas to corral the fish. And then, unfortunately, the lights on the bridge at night shine onto the water, and that gives seals an advantage because that means that they can basically feed on the salmon 24/7. As visual predators, they can use nighttime feeding as well. There's, not as many lights, but one thing that Port Gamble Squallum tribe discovered is that in the areas with lights at night, when they compared them to areas without lights at night, there were a lot more harbor seal activity. So clearly the harbor seals are benefiting from those lights. So the next step is to try to seek solutions. So now that we think that we've solved the mystery of why the steelhead juveniles are dying at the bridge, we're trying to figure out what are the solutions to this. Again, I can't see your comments, but if you have any ideas, we would love to hear them. We're always open to ideas, and we can always get some cool creative ideas from folks. I presented recently to a group of 5th graders, and they had lots of great ideas. So don't be shy. And I'll tell you at least one of the ideas that we're working on right now. So add your ideas. So what we're working on right now, and here is a picture, it's kind of cut off, but you can kind of see how these corner pontoons in the diagram create these 90-degree corners where the fish get disoriented, there's eddies that form, and the predators take advantage of that. And so one of the ideas that we're working on is developing fish guidance structures that basically allow the fish to guide them around these corners. And the technical engineering term is called fillets, which for the first 4 months of my job, I pronounced fillets. It's not, I'm just a fish biologist, so I think of fillets, but they're called fillets. And they are these triangular structures that kind of fill that corner. And the fillets are intended to reduce predation-related mortality by excluding fish and predators from the corner areas and facilitating fish passage by guiding fish towards the open spans on either side of the bridge. So predators they can kind of herd fish along the length of the bridge, but they can't use those corners, and it allows fish an escape route. It prevents those eddies from forming, or reduces eddies from forming in those corners. And that might help also keep fish a little bit more oriented correctly. And it might improve their ability to navigate past the bridge. So I just want to note that these fish aren't to scale. They're supposed to be juveniles. This bridge is very big. And you can't really tell, this fish guidance little triangle here looks so small, but in reality, these are really big structures. So the first one is being built right now, and we're going to test it in the spring, starting in March, April. And these structures are huge. So they're triangular, and they're 60 by 60 by 85 feet. So this is a really big structure. They're made out of plastic pipes that can be filled with water to allow it to be buoyant, so we can attach it to the bridge and it'll just, be floating there. And they have this plastic sheet face that's green, that's basically just going to be a wall. And so fish will swim and they'll approach it and they'll just swim along the green plastic face. But these structures weigh a lot. And so I was trying to figure out a fun way to try to demonstrate how much they weigh out of water. And I got the average weight of an orca and divided the weight of the structure, and you end up with 6 orca whales. So the weight of this structure out of water is equivalent to 6 orca whales. So this is a really heavy, big structure. And to provide a bit more context, oh, and then it's also the length of 2 male orca whales. So again, very big. So to provide some context, our engineers gave us these photos of a similar structure that was built. And here you can see a man standing next to it. You can see it on a flatbed truck. This is just one piece of the structure. And so the structure that we're building will be able to break down in about a dozen truckable parts. And so this would be like just one of the 11 or 12 pieces. So these are really big structures. And they will hopefully fill that corner space and help guide fish around. And so this is one of the what we're calling kind of near-term solutions. These structures are big, they're robust, they could last 10 years, they could be fixed, last 20 years, 30 years. But in the long term, we want to significantly increase steelhead survival past the Hood Canal Bridge. In order to do that, we really need to have a bridge that is more fish friendly. Right now, even if we can get them around those corners, even if we can do other things to deter seals, like use acoustic devices that will deter seals, even if we do all these things, it's still a barrier to fish that are trying to get around. And so what we'd like to do in the long term is to lay the foundation for a redesigned bridge. And this doesn't mean that a new bridge is coming anytime soon. It just means that the bridge will have a lifespan. At some point, the bridge will need to be replaced or repaired. And it may make sense at that point to build a newly designed bridge that is more fish friendly. And there's a lot of things that could also better serve people in the community. And so we also want to think about, could this fish-friendly bridge help the people that are trying to use the bridge? And the bridge, if you've ever driven across it, you may have gotten stuck there when it opens. It opens over 400 times a year. So in 2018, WashDOT recorded 417 closures. And when it closes, it can back up vehicles for like an hour. And that can significantly increase commute times. It can potentially impact emergency medical response. It could impact tourism, emergency evacuation. There's a bunch of reasons why you may not want a bridge that has to have a drawbridge component. The other thing is that it can impact naval readiness. So we have this fleet of nuclear submarines and they're behind the bridge. And so anytime they need to go out to the ocean, you have to open the bridge. And they don't like to telegraph when they're moving their submarines. And so they don't give people a lot of heads up for when that submarine's coming through. So that adds a disruption to traffic and things like that. So they would probably like to not have to do that to move their submarines. And so long-term, one example to look towards is Norway, because Hood Canal is a fjord and Norway is known for their majestic fjords. And so they've had to build a lot of bridges across those fjords. And they also use floating bridges. This is a depiction, a drawing of a future bridge that is about to be built in Norway. I won't pretend to know how to pronounce that. But this would be a very large bridge. It will be the longest floating bridge in the world. It's over 5 kilometers long. And there's a couple features of this bridge that make it really intriguing to those of us working on the Hood Canal Bridge. And the first feature is that you'll see that they have pontoons that they're floating on, but the pontoons are parallel to the water flow and perpendicular to the bridge. And so there is water flowing in between each pontoon. So the pontoons aren't obstructing the water and they're allowing fish and other animals to move in between each pontoon. And so it would be much more fish friendly. And then the other thing to note in this picture is that it has a very high main span that allows large fish, that would be a very large fish, large boats to pass under it. And so it doesn't need a drawbridge. And that would be a huge benefit potentially to all the community. So we are pursuing also having some designs that we could put in our back pocket so that when the bridge needs to be replaced or significant repairs, then maybe we could rebuild it in a more fish-friendly, community-friendly fashion. So in conclusion, steelhead and salmon are culturally, economically, ecologically important to the Puget Sound. And the Hood Canal Bridge is also vital for the peninsula. And it's also this impressive engineering feat to be able to cross the Hood Canal on this floating concrete structure. But up to 50% of the young steelhead that encounter it are dying near the bridge. And the bridge's design and abundant steels nearby appear to be the culprit. And so, hopefully we'll be able to resolve this in a way that makes it more fish friendly. And a consortium of tribal, federal, and state agencies has gotten together with Long Live the Kings and other nonprofits to investigate the issue and develop solutions for addressing the fish passage problem at the bridge. So I just want to take a moment to thank our partners, in particular, those whose research I presented. I tried to highlight everybody who was involved: Port Gamble Slalom Tribe and NOAA, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Those researchers in particular were instrumental to solving this mystery. So I want to thank them, and then just give you my contact information in case you have more questions than I can answer today, and then other information about LLTK. So yeah, and I'm available to answer questions. And I think I can see the chat now.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. I love the mystery aspect of it. People on the Zoom got it right, and Miranda wants to facilitate any of those Facebook questions on over to me. That would be great. But we've got some in the Zoom right now. You ready to answer questions?
Sure. And I can, as I said, I did not do the research. We are, facilitating the project. So if there are questions that I can't answer, I will defer to the researchers and I can get answers for you guys. So.
Okay. First one we have is, why would harvest reductions impact migrating smolt survival?
Oh, that is a very good question. That was not intended to be a direct line. So what I meant was that overall, the populations have not. So I realized that I had showed a graph of the marine survival going down, but overall populations have also gone down with that marine survival. And so the overall populations of these steelhead and Chinook have not recovered despite any changes in harvest. And so I agree, that was misleading, confusing, and I apologize. But what I mean by that is that the populations have gone down and that we haven't seen recovery with changes in harvest.
And then the next one is, what about pinniped hazing or perhaps allowing tribal harvesting near the Hood Canal Bridge?
Yeah, so I can't speak to any kind of harvesting of pinnipeds, but I can speak to hazing. And so one of the elements that I didn't talk about is something that we're looking into trying to test at the bridge. Is something called a targeted acoustic startle technology device. So we call it the TAST for short, TAST. And if you are familiar with it, it has been tested at the Ballard Locks, which is another pinch point place where there's a lot of predation by pinnipeds. And what it does is it uses a sound that in particular elicits a startle device or a startle response in pinnipeds. And so seals and sea lions, they get startled by the sound as opposed to other acoustic devices that are meant to just scare them away. This one is supposed to elicit its flight or fight response. And it is supposed to be a bit unnerving and they're not supposed to get used to it. So part of the problem with other acoustic deterrence has been that fish are just so, or seals and sea lions are just so motivated to get those fish that they just like block it out and they don't care, or they lose their hearing and they don't care. But the idea is that this this is kind of a startle device. And so it was developed in Scotland, and it's being tested throughout Washington state, and we're looking to try to test it at the bridge next spring. And so that would be another way to try to keep seals and seals away from the bridge. And in particular, you know, spots on the bridge where we see higher mortality.
It's interesting that it just startles them, but that sometimes they're too motivated to care about other noises.
Yes, a good dinner is a very big motivator.
I hope none of our participants are feeling that right now.
I know, it's just noticing the time.
Are steelhead kelts as vulnerable through the bridge as steelhead fry?
That is a great question. No one to my knowledge has looked at that. I also had the same question about returning adults that also have to pass the bridge. So adults haven't been tagged in terms of steelhead. And part of the reason for that is just that they are so rare that they would be hard to handle and tag. And so we haven't done any work with steelhead adults to look at how they respond to the bridge. I would posit that they would be likely to encounter the bridge at the surface and have similar issues. And the reason I say that is because recent research using satellite tags on adult kelts out in the ocean, they were tagged up in Alaska by researchers and then released, and they had the fish swimming out in the North Pacific Ocean, far away from land. And they were swimming at the surface still as adult kelts. And so that makes me think that just in general, steelhead like to swim at the surface. And so it's very likely that kelts would also have a problem. I don't think anybody's proposed to look at that quite yet. But we have started looking at adult Chinook salmon and chum salmon just this fall. And so we don't have the data yet. But Megan Moore, who's doing the work for NOAA, has worked with the Port Gamble Squam tribe and WDFW to catch returning adults as they enter Hood Canal. And they've tagged them with similar tags, but externally, so that it doesn't, affect them if they're carrying eggs. Tag them externally and then watch as they approach the bridge. And so what we'd like to know is, do adults have similar issues? And so we're looking in particular at Chinook and fall run chum, because those are easier to catch at, in terms of numbers. Mm-hmm. So stay tuned. We'll have results on that.
Still more research to be done. Always more research. Another question is Long Live the King sharing this research directly with stakeholders and any other new bridge construction projects here in Washington or anywhere else in the world?
That's a really good question. We are trying to share the information as much as possible, and talks like this are a great opportunity to do that. The consortium of folks working on this is a really great example of multidisciplinary effort. And so WashDOT, so the Washington Department of Transportation, is heavily involved in all of the assessment team meetings, management committee meetings. And so they are very aware of this data and can share it with their colleagues who are building bridges. And so we have a lot of different partners that are communicating that. I don't think we've communicated it internationally. And so that could be something that, attending engineering conferences and stuff like that. But it is a really interesting challenge, and we're trying to find new ways to communicate that and share it with folks.
Go to an engineering conference and learn about salmon. You got to add some variety there.
Yeah, I would learn a lot about engineering.
Speaking of engineering, how does weight of the triangle diversion structure affect the floatability of the pontoons?
That is a very good question. That was something that was very important to WSDOT. You can imagine they do not want anything to happen to those pontoons. Nobody wants anything to happen to those pontoons, right? You don't want them to get harmed in any way. And so they have very strict rules about how you can interact with the pontoons to make sure that they don't get punctured, because the whole point is that they are hollow, and that is what allows the bridge to float. And some of you may know that at one point, half of the bridge did sink. And so that was because the pontoons were compromised. So they're very careful. And so these are not actually, we're not drilling anything into the pontoons. We are attaching them through these kind of belly straps that wrap around the pontoons, and then we attach the structure to it. And so they're just attached to attachments that are then attached to the bridge. And I have worked with an engineering firm that has a naval architect in particular to make sure that the buoyancy has been designed specifically to not put any pressure on the bridge. And so it has to be designed to be towable, because we have to be able to tow it in and out. I didn't talk in detail about how we're testing it, but we're actually going to be testing it this spring by placing it in place for a week, and then removing it for a week, and then putting it in place for a week and removing it for a week. And then throughout that whole time, we'll be releasing tagged steelhead. And so we'll be able to compare the weeks where the structure is in place with the weeks where the structure isn't, to see if we see differences in survival. So all that towing back and forth meant that we had to have a really well-designed structure that could float. And so we had a naval architect to design it, and then WSDOT went through several rounds of review to make sure that they were comfortable with it being attached to the bridge, and everyone's on board, and it's now being built. So it's quite a process, but basically really good engineers is the answer.
Nice. And then do we see similar mortality numbers with other bridges on Puget Sound, like the Tacoma Narrows?
That's a great question. I don't know if anybody's worked on that in particular, but I assume that telemetry, that fish with acoustic tags in them have been tagged upstream of the bridge and past the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. So I would assume that had they seen high levels of mortality, that would have been concerning. I think that there have been studies that have had fish past the Narrows Bridge, and so I would assume that they would have caught that or picked up on that, but I don't think there have been any studies in particular looking at that. There have been studies around the bridges in Lake Washington, and there's been a lot of research done by University of Washington and others looking at how those floating bridges affect fish and salmon migrating through the lakes.
And where would people find information about that?
That is a good question. I could send that along, and we could post that somehow. Yeah, I don't have it on the off the top of my head, but I can try to find it and pass it along.
And then there was comments in the chat wondering if salmonoid refugia, perhaps a specific type like nearby macroalgae or seagrass wetlands, would help or impact the salmon via pinniped predation, knowing that slowed out migrations is part of the problem.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the juveniles that are migrating out are steelhead, and steelhead tend to be very focused on migrating out to the ocean. They've already spent a year in freshwater and they are ready to head out, and they will get out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca in a few days. They're very unlikely to use kind of spaces as refugia as they migrate out. That said, we have not yet looked at out migrating Chinook. Because in particular, Chinook migrate out at a smaller size we would need much smaller tags, which are surprisingly more expensive. The smaller the tag, the more expensive they are because they're harder to make. They have shorter battery life. There's a bunch of reasons why it would be much more difficult to follow Chinook salmon. But one of the reasons is because they are much more likely to hang out in refugia. And so they're not going to be as easy to track because they might go over here and check something out over here. They might go over here. They've also noticed that the bridge almost acts like a refugia in some ways, if you don't consider the element of the harbor seals, because the bridge is attracting a lot of zooplankton and phytoplankton, which, especially with the lights at night, which then attracts small fish, and you get this whole food web kind of developing associated with the bridge. You saw in that video all of the marine life that's attached to the bridge. It's pretty spectacular. There's a lot going on under that bridge that we don't see. And that can be a challenge in some ways because it offers this place for out-migrating Chinook salmon and chum to hang out and feed. Unfortunately, the harbor seals have figured that out as well, and so they're coming and feeding as well. And so there's a blessing and a curse to the bridge forming its own little refugia. But I don't know in terms of Chinook salmon and chum salmon if other refugia would benefit them. And we just haven't been able to tag and track them the same way. So.
If you have any more questions for Shaara, you can send her that email through her email address right there. But because we are out of time for our presentation. So thank you again, Shaara, for sharing this information with us and our community so we could spark these conversations that are really blooming out there. And then thank you to everyone who joined us, those on Zoom and those on Facebook Live. It's because of you that we run these, and so we're so glad that you came to listen to our talks. Make sure that you do share them with your friends and family so that they can learn about this cool steelhead mystery that was solved. I love the part where they can track the temperature, and then they notice that the temperature had a spike and then it dropped off. It's like, oh, the fish was eaten by something warm-blooded and then it was pooped out. That's my favorite
Telltale sign. Yeah, it is really great to be able to kind of put it in this context because it was just fun. I've been presenting on this for a year now, but it was fun to be able to try it a different way. And so thanks for humoring me and letting me do this murder mystery presentation.
Oh, the best. So if anyone did their coloring page, this was drawn by our volunteer Lorelei. Send us pictures of yours if you colored them. And then follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or check our website for when we'll announce our next speaker, which will be January 5th, 6:30 p.m. as always. And then if you are too excited about the turning of the tides, we have an event at the estuarium. It's free. You can come down on Saturday, the 17th of December. We'll have artists with booths out there of local Pacific Northwest art. We'll have other organizations in Olympia coming out to talk to you about their work. We'll have some hot beverages cooking, and you can do some like salmon prints where you paint a rubber salmon, slap it on a sheet of paper. You get to take home the print of the salmon, or maybe your steelhead. But I hope you all have a good rest of your evening. Thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you.